Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, hello, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I mostly focus on true crime, but sometimes I like to focus on maybe a lighter video. I like to cover general mysteries and history, and today's video very much sits at the intersection of the latter. I'm really excited to talk about this one. This one has been absolutely fascinating to learn about, but first, I just have a little message from past Georgia. Oh hello, Past Georgia here. For today's video, I've partnered with MyHeritage, and I don't usually jump into sponsorships in my video so abruptly, so do bear with me here. This all ties into the story that I'm going to be sharing today, and that is us exploring the theories that maybe Shakespeare didn't write his own plays. So you might remember that I partnered with MyHeritage a few weeks ago for another video, and I started working on my family tree, something which I have hugely enjoyed doing. I have absolutely loved piecing together my family tree through historical records and family conversations. But did you know they also offer a DNA service, which makes exploring your family history easier than ever? So back in August, I did a very simple cheek swab and sent the kit off to the MyHeritage lab so they could analyse my DNA and send me a breakdown of my ethnicity. And whilst I've been waiting over the past few weeks, I've been playing around on the site using the photo features to enhance old family photos. You can colorise and animate these photos, so here I am analysing an old photo of William Shakespeare. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Or should I say, I'm animating an old painting of William Shakespeare because cameras didn't exist back then. Anyway, I've just received my email saying that my results are now ready and I cannot wait to open them, so I literally set up my camera immediately and I'm filming this. I am so fascinated to see what these results come back as because, as I said, I've been working away at my family tree for weeks now, and so far I've been able to trace my lineage back to the 16th century. And not a single one of those people has been born outside of Britain. I do know from my parents that I definitely do have Irish ancestry as well. I just haven't explored those branches of my tree yet. Do we reckon I have anything other than British and Irish in me? Looking at this pasty skin, I would very much hazard a guess that I do not. But let's take a look. Okay, let's go. Oh, I'm so excited. Let's see. Georgia, you are, drum roll please, 74.7% Irish, Scottish and Welsh. And 23.1% English. That does leave some room for something else. And 1.3%, no, 1.4% Middle Eastern. That's wild. 0.8% East European. That kind of makes sense. What else? That's it. That is it. That is fascinating. The 23.1% English has really surprised me because I would have thought I was a lot more English than I was Irish. I would hazard a guess that out of that 74.7% Irish, Scottish and Welsh, that is pretty much all Irish. Because I do know with certainty that I have got a lot of Irish in my bloodline. I just haven't really explored that yet. But let's click on View Full Ethnicity Estimate. Let's see what this says. What's this little circle here? Oh, southeastern and eastern England. It is correct. I live in southeast England, and as far as I know, the majority of my grandparents are from London and the surrounding areas, so that makes sense. And is this also linking? Oh my god, so it's also linking me to other people, I think. Oh, showing as my genetic group has moved around the world. That's so cool. Overview, 74.7% Irish, Scottish, Welsh, that makes sense. DNA matches, I have 9,835 DNA matches. 0 close family, that kind of makes sense. 19 extended family, and then nearly 10,000 distant relatives. This is so fun. I'm going to be in a hole looking at this for the next 4 hours. Oh, I'm so excited to review all these DNA matches and then add them to my tree. That is going to keep me entertained all night tonight. Back to present day Georgia, and I can confirm I did indeed spend all of that night and many nights after going through my DNA matches and expanding my family tree. MyHeritage does have a promotion on right now. You can click the link in the description box and use my coupon code Georgia for free shipping on your own DNA kit. And there will also be a cheeky link in there for a free 30-day trial of MyHeritage, and then if you decide to continue using it, you'll get 50% off. But how does this tie in with Shakespeare, Georgia, I hear you ask? Well, some of the more astute of you may have figured it out by now, but I made the wonderful discovery through MyHeritage that I am in fact related to William Shakespeare. I know, my brains and incredible talent for writing had to come from somewhere, so I don't know why I'm surprised. I joke, but you do have to admit that is pretty damn cool. If my family treeing is correct, and I really hope it is, it turns out that I'm a direct ancestor of John or Johannes Shakespeare, who's William Shakespeare's father. I found the name Shakespeare back in my tree just a few generations up. I got intrigued and so followed it all the way through to the 16th century, just on the off chance it was the same Shakespeare's. And it was, which is the coolest thing ever. I think William Shakespeare is my 15th great uncle, I think. I know when you go back that far, anyone is related to anyone, but you better believe I'm taking that fact and making it my newest fun fact for every party I go to ever. But anyway, that gave me a very fun idea for this episode, unravelling the theories that maybe Shakespeare didn't write his own plays. William Shakespeare has long been revered as one of the greatest writers of all time, with work spanning a wide range of genres. Tragedy, comedy, history, he could do it all. His plays are enduring. We all know the story of Romeo and Juliet, or Othello, of The Tempest, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And even if you don't know the plays themselves, you will know the modern retellings. 10 Things I Hate About You is just the millennial Taming of the Shrew. West Side Story, Romeo and Juliet. The Lion King is Hamlet. My personal favourite, She's the Man, is a Twelfth Night retelling. They didn't even change the names in the movie. Viola, Sebastian, Duke, Olivia. The school is Illyria. Point is, we've all been influenced by Shakespeare's work, even if we don't think we have. However, there is a small subsection of scholars out there who don't believe that Shakespeare wrote his plays at all, and these are a group of people called anti-Stratfordians. They believe that Shakespeare of Stratford was a front to shield the identity of the real author or authors of this work, who for whatever reason didn't want to accept the credit. It is a pretty fringe theory, most people don't really put any stock in it, but hey, we love a mystery over here, we love a harmless conspiracy, so let's look into it. It's important to note going in here that throughout Shakespeare's life and in the centuries that followed, no one had any questions over the authorship of Shakespeare's plays. He was the writer, it wasn't contested at all. It was only around the middle of the 19th century, when Shakespeare really began to be revered as one of the greatest writers of all time, that some scholars began to sort of suggest that his humble origins and an obscure life were not compatible with the genius of his plays. Simply, they believed that Shakespeare lacked the education, the status, and the familiarity with royalty to have written his plays. And I do just have to share with you a side note that my researcher wrote alongside this in the notes. I'm really glad nobody thinks this way anymore. Oh yeah, it's just classism, isn't it? Sigh. I can't claim credit for that, but it did really make me chuckle, so I had to include it in here. Going into this episode, I thought it was going to be reviewing all the evidence, doing my usual fair look at everything, and coming to a solid conclusion. But I feel I need to say right now that this is actually going to be more of a debunking, because nothing in the research here was actually able to convince me that Shakespeare didn't write his plays. It's fun to look at all the evidence and analyse it, we love a debunking, but I wasn't convinced. So, since this question first arose a couple of centuries ago, more than 80 different candidates have been suggested as being the true writer of Shakespeare's plays. You've got Sir Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere, Christopher Marlowe, William Stanley, and many, many others. No direct evidence exists to point to any of these candidates, and most Shakespeare scholars only ever acknowledge this theory to just swiftly dismiss it. American Shakespeare scholar Gail Kern-Pastor said in 1999, "To ask me about the authorship question is like asking a paleontologist to debate a creationist's account of the fossil record. But ask an anti-Stratfordian and they will have a whole list of reasons for you as to why their theory is legitimate." Over the years, many public figures have kind of endorsed the anti-Stratfordian ideas, which has only served to push it further out into public awareness. We're talking people like Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Prince Philip, Charlie Chaplin, Sigmund Freud, and Helen Keller. But they also only viewed the argument as having potential rather than having anything solid behind it. Again, there's no actual evidence. By comparison, actual Shakespeare scholars rely on direct documentary evidence, government records, testimony from those who worked with or near Shakespeare in his life. Sure, there is a lack of surviving records from this time, but we are talking over 400 years ago, so you can kind of allow for a lack of documentation. So, what is the anti-Stratfordian argument, the argument that Shakespeare didn't write his own plays? They rely on a rhetoric of accumulation or circumstantial evidence. They find similarities between the characters and events of Shakespeare's plays and the biographies of the people they're arguing are the true author. They explore literary parallels between the plays and the true author's work. I mean, they even think there are cryptic codes hidden within Shakespeare's work. Honestly, it kind of sounds like being a Swiftie. I am guilty. For anti-Stratfordians, the baseline is this. It is pretty clear that Shakespeare's work shows a high level of knowledge of foreign languages, geography, familiarity with both Elizabethan and Jacobean royal courts and politics. I've tried about a million times to say Jacobean. For some reason, the word just isn't working for me today. In order to have such knowledge, Shakespeare must have been incredibly highly educated, or at least incredibly well read. But no evidence of a library of his has ever been found. No books, no manuscripts, no letters or diaries. How did this man from Stratford-upon-Avon amass such incredible worldly knowledge? For many anti-strats, which is what we're going to call them from now on, this is their biggest piece of evidence. Shakespeare simply shouldn't have known the things he did. However, it's not out of the question that he simply spent long periods of time away from home and he interacted with people from all walks of life. Maybe Shakespeare was just one of those people who are like sponges, one of those people who absorbs knowledge wherever they go. Shakespeare didn't necessarily need books to learn these things, but maybe these books were simply just no longer in his possession when he died. Maybe they've been destroyed over the past 4 centuries. Not having any books now that belong to Shakespeare doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have them then. But anti-strats also believe that Stratford-upon-Avon, which is where Shakespeare grew up, was a cultural backwater lacking the environment necessary to nurture a genius. In short, someone of his intelligence simply couldn't have come from a place like Stratford-upon-Avon. They make the argument that he can't have been intelligent, and it's more likely he was actually illiterate. Shakespeare's parents, Mary Arden and John Shakespeare, signed their wedding document with just a single mark, suggesting that they couldn't read or write. If Shakespeare's parents were illiterate, the likelihood is that William Shakespeare was too. There's also no evidence of Shakespeare's daughters, Judith and Susanna, being literate either. I mean, why would Shakespeare not teach his daughters to read and write? It's also suggested that his plays, which depict women from across the social spectrum composing, reading, delivering letters, must have come from a more educated background in which women were taught to read and write. In a place like Stratford-upon-Avon, they simply weren't. Also, Shakespeare's plays discuss aristocratic sports in detail, sports which Shakespeare, coming from a lower class family, technically shouldn't have really known the details of. John Shakespeare did work as a glove maker, but he did also become a very important figure in Stratford. He fulfilled all these civic positions in the town, so he did likely have an elevated status and a bit more money. He may have been able to send his children to the local grammar school. But the family definitely weren't upper class by any means, and there's no actual evidence of Shakespeare ever attending a grammar school. It's just kind of theories. So how did Shakespeare know about the details and intricacies of these upper class sports? We don't really know, we can just assume through life, through talking to people. But his writings at points even seem to ridicule low status people, which some anti-strats do consider to be hypocritical. Shakespeare was lower class himself, why is he making fun of himself, of his family? But to be honest, I do find this argument very weak. I mean, if there's anyone in this world you can poke fun at, it's yourself and your situation. There is this lack of documentary proof of Shakespeare's education, though. Like I said, he may have gone to the local grammar school, but there's no documentation of such a thing. But in fairness, there's no records of any other students that exist either, there's just nothing. His plays show a level of knowledge of Latin, Greek, and mythology that would definitely suggest this grammar school education. His vocabulary is estimated to have been between 17,500 to 29,000 words. But with no proof of such an education, how could he have learned so much? But again, I refer back to just life experience, talking to people, getting out of this town, travelling. I refer us back to our earlier point of classism. It's like somebody in a private school now wondering how on earth people in state-funded schools are actually intelligent. How does somebody in a state-funded school end up being able to go to university or earning a lot of money or being smart? Like, it's ridiculous, isn't it? I really don't think the class you're born into or the education you're able to get, what school you go to, has any bearing really on how intelligent you actually are. Everyone's very intelligent in different ways. But let's go back to the illiterate argument. To this day, there are only 6 surviving signatures of Shakespeare, and there are no surviving letters or manuscripts. It's often said that Shakespeare signed with simply a mark like his parents did on their wedding document, or if he did actually sign his name, he did so with inconsistent spelling. Shakespeare couldn't even spell his name. How on earth was he writing these incredible plays? Turns out this may have just been a playwright thing of this time. They were quirky. A lot of playwrights would write their name in secretary style and or just use breviagraphs, symbols or marks to replace parts of words to shorten them. The fact that Shakespeare used a mark to sign his own name really means nothing. My own signature is literally just a squiggle. It's a squiggle. There's no letters, there's no discernible letters in there. It's like saying, I'm illiterate because I just sign with a squiggle. No, I'm just lazy. There's a very similar argument in the fact that Shakespeare constantly seems to spell his name differently on his title pages. He switches between the S-P-E-A-R-E spelling and S-P-E-A-R. Now, in the family tree, this is actually something I saw multiple times. The entire family throughout the centuries very much does seem to switch between the two spellings. It could just be that no one, including William here, truly knew how to spell their family name. It's said that in the signatures, it's also spelt differently, but again, nobody really knew whether it came with an E or not. They just did whatever they were feeling in the moment. Anti-Strat suggests that these differences in spelling are because it was another author using a pseudonym. They kept forgetting which way they were spelling it. But why would somebody want to use a pseudonym on these incredible plays? Well, it's been suggested that if it was Christopher Marlowe, he may have wanted to use a pseudonym to avoid imprisonment after faking his own death. If it was Francis Bacon, he may have wanted to avoid scrutiny for advocating for a more republican form of government. If it was a woman, well, nobody would read a play written by a woman. There are lots of reasons why somebody would want to write under a fake name, under a pseudonym. Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April 1616, aged 52. We don't know the cause of his death, but we do know that he did actually make his will just 1 month before he died, in which he described himself in perfect health and memory, God be praised. However, this doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't mean he actually was in perfect health. This was a very common phrase at this time, and it was just one of those things you kind of said. This will was apparently a redrafting of one he'd made in the January before this, so he may well have actually been ill. He may well have known that he was going to die soon, so he was just updating his will. In this will, Shakespeare makes no mention of any personal papers, books, poems, or his 18 unpublished plays. You'd think that he'd want to make some sort of plan as to what he was going to do with these things, but he just doesn't. He does, though, mention sending money to actors for them to buy mourning rings, which is exactly what it sounds like, a ring worn on any finger in memory of somebody who died. That was more important to him than worrying about his plays. Something which, again, many anti-strats argue that a true author of these plays would probably really care. But again, maybe Shakespeare just didn't realise what a big deal he was. Shakespeare wouldn't have known at this time that 400 years later, 500, 600 years later, people are still going to be talking about his work. The final big anti-Strat argument tends to refer to a monument of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, located inside the Holy Trinity Church. The date the monument was placed there isn't known exactly, but there is hard evidence that it was there before 1623. It was then restored in the mid-1700s and has been repainted several times over the centuries. Now, the earliest hand-drawn image of this effigy was by William Dugdale in 1634, and the earliest printed image is featured in 1656 Antiquities of Warwickshire, and both of those images look very different to the monument today. Today, the monument depicts a demi-figure of Shakespeare holding a pen or a quill and paper, leaning on a thin cushion as if he is writing. But the earliest images of the effigy don't show a pen at all. Instead, it shows Shakespeare holding some sort of sack of grain or maybe wool. It is completely different. These earliest images also feature the monument with a downturned moustache, whereas the effigies today is upturned. Now, this is very interesting. I don't know that it necessarily proves that Shakespeare didn't write his plays, but it's fascinating to look at. The argument around this from the anti-strats, I think, is confusing, but they're basically arguing that whilst the original effigy was that of Shakespeare, it was the wrong Shakespeare. It was of William's father, John, who worked very closely with wool in his life. He was known as a considerable dealer of wool, working with gloves. The anti-strats have long argued that when the monument was restored in the mid-1700s, the wool sack the effigy was holding was then changed into the thin cushion, which the effigy is now depicted as leaning on to write with his pen and paper. Apparently, this was changed purposefully to fool people into believing that this illiterate man from Stratford was actually the writer of Shakespeare's works. Somehow at this point the figure was altered or replaced entirely. Now, this is something I don't really have an explanation for. It seems like the effigy may indeed have changed over the centuries, but the early drawings of the monument are barely solid proof of anything. Maybe William Dugdale was just a terrible drawer who couldn't draw hands holding things. The hands in the Dugdale drawing are curved as if they're holding something, and they're in the same positions they are now. It just doesn't have the pen or the paper. Honestly, there is so much wild analysis of this monument online that this could be an hour-long video in itself, but I'm trying to keep it brief, trying to keep it understandable. In 1725, Alexander Pope published an edition of Shakespeare's work, including a drawing of the monument by a George Virtue. Now, this drawing was apparently done in 1723 and is kind of the strongest evidence against the claim that the monument was altered 25 or so years later, as the details of this drawing correspond almost exactly with the monument as it still stands today, including the pen and paper. But then, strangely, 61 years after this and 37 years after the restoration of the monument in the mid-1700s, another artist called Grignon drew the monument, and in his, he also omits the pen and paper. The pen and paper aren't there. He also repeats other details as seen in earlier drawings of the monument with no pen and paper, such as the shape of the right hand and the addition of an animal head on the column behind the monument, which simply just doesn't exist. This animal head has never existed. So you've got these anti-strats arguing that these drawings without the pen and paper are obvious proof that at some point the monument was changed. The monument was adjusted to pretend that this guy wrote Shakespeare's works. But the simplest explanation, these people who don't draw the pen and paper just never saw the monument in person. They're just copying the earliest version of the drawing. The earliest version in which William Dugdale probably just didn't know how to draw a hand holding a pen and paper. That could be it. I mean, Grignon in the late 1700s also drew Shakespeare with a full head of hair, something that we all know Shakespeare didn't have. It's a bad game of monument drawing telephone. Most of these people never saw the monument in person, they're just copying the earliest drawings. That is the simplest explanation here. But for funsies, let's actually look at some of the alternative candidates for Shakespeare over the years, the most famous of which is probably Sir Francis Bacon. I know I'd heard that rumour about Francis Bacon even before I started looking into this episode. Sir Francis Bacon was a lawyer, philosopher, scientist, and essayist. He is one of the great intellectual figures of Jacobean England. I said it right that time, incredible. He was first proposed as Shakespeare by William Henry Smith in 1856, and a year later, Delia Bacon, who is unrelated, just the same surname, would say the same, completely unprompted. Smith compared passages from Bacon and Shakespeare's work, and he noticed similarities. For example, Bacon wrote, "Poetry is nothing else but feigned history. Compared with Shakespeare's, the truest poetry is the most feigning from As You Like It." You've then got Bacon's, "He wished him not to shut the gate of your majesty's mercy," alongside Shakespeare's, "The gate of mercy shall all be shut up," from Henry V. Definitely similar, but maybe it's just the way that people wrote in this time. Delia Bacon suggested that Francis Bacon may have been the leader of a group of disaffected philosopher-politicians, and he wished to be able to promote Republican ideas, but he didn't want to suffer the consequences of doing so he wrote under a pseudonym. In a letter, Bacon once wrote, "So desiring you to be good to concealed poets," which anti-strats will argue is self-referential, concealed poets. And then we have this next bit, which is completely insane. But anti-strats claim to have found ciphers within Shakespeare's work, which support their theory. Again, I can't judge, I'm a Swiftie. I'm holding back on the judgment. So this cipher thing started in 1881 when C.F. Ashmead Windle said that she found jingles in each play. I'm going to be entirely honest with you and I say I tried to understand what Windle was seeing in these apparent jingles, what jingles even meant. I'll include a screenshot on screen now, but honestly, I have nothing. This means nothing to me. I've tried to understand it. I just don't get it. I'm clearly not as intelligent as Shakespeare. But I think the general consensus was there wasn't really much in what Windle was seeing in her apparent jingles, but this did open the floodgates and now everyone was looking for ciphers within the Shakespeare works. Dr. Isaac Hull Platt argued that the word, and please do bear with me here, honorifica bilitudentatibus, used in Love's Labour's Lost, which is a Latin word translated to the state of being able to achieve honours, is actually an anagram of a Latin phrase. Apparently this is an anagram of, and I'm just going to have to read off my computer because autocorrect has messed up my autocue. It's an anagram of Hi Ludi F Bacanis Nati Tuti Orbi in Latin, which translates in English to "These plays, the offspring of F Bacon, are preserved for the world." I'll let you make up your own mind about that. There are some other small points as well. One of Bacon's friends wrote that he was known to the world under another name. He was also known to have considered publishing his philosophical works under a pseudonym, so the idea of Bacon writing under a pseudonym wasn't all that crazy. It's also said that a major source for Shakespeare's The Tempest was a confidential letter called the True Repertory, sent back from the Virginia colony in 1610 for the Council of Virginia Company, of which Bacon was known to be a prominent member. If Bacon wasn't Shakespeare, how would Shakespeare have really known about this? Bacon's life also spanned the Shakespeare period almost perfectly, although do take that with a pinch of salt because a lot of people's lives would have. It's like saying that my life spanned the Taylor Swift period almost perfectly. How many times can I reference Taylor Swift in one video? Just all this, Andy Strat, Swifties, I feel like we're together in this. Moving into the 20th century though, Bacon would get replaced as the main suspect here by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. De Vere was a very well-known patron of the arts in Shakespeare's time. He sponsored companies of actors and patronised musicians, but he was also praised as a poet and playwright himself, although none of his plays survive today. As a result, De Vere did have big connections with the London theatre scene and with royalty, specifically with Elizabeth I. He had an incredibly well-educated upbringing, about at the level that anti-strats think that Shakespeare must have had to be able to write the things he did. J. Thomas Looney was the first person to present De Vere as an option here, and he would end up writing about it at length in his 1920 book, Shakespeare Identified. He compared the poetry of the two and he identified characteristics in Shakespeare's work that apparently painted the author as an eccentric aristocrat poet, a drama and sporting enthusiast with a classical education that travelled extensively to Italy. De Vere. He was much more likely to be able to write the plays than poorly educated William Shakespeare from Stratford, the glove maker's son. You ask an anti-strat and they will say that the Shakespeare plays are full of references to the author's apparent career at court and his fall from grace, and a relationship with Queen Elizabeth and her chief minister Lord Burleigh, who is believed to have been satirised as Polonius in Hamlet. Little William Shakespeare from Stratford wouldn't have had this kind of lifestyle, he wouldn't have had these kind of relationships, he wouldn't have known Lord Burleigh well enough to satirise him in Hamlet. But if this is the case, why would De Vere want to remain anonymous? Well, many of Shakespeare's plays were political satires of court life and critiques of the government. Somebody like De Vere, an earl high in society, couldn't have been seen as having these types of views. It's said that the new flow of Shakespeare's work ceased around the time of De Vere's death, and in 1623 it was De Vere's family that apparently financed the first folio of Shakespeare's works, one of the dedicatees of this being De Vere's son-in-law Philip Herbert. Maybe De Vere was Shakespeare, maybe he just had a deep appreciation for the arts and his family wanted to honour that after his death. Maybe. Another name I've mentioned a couple of times throughout this video is that of Christopher Marlowe. He was born in Canterbury as the son of a cobbler, and he managed to get a scholarship to the King's School, where the boys were encouraged to write poetry in Latin and perform plays. He then got another scholarship to Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, he got an MA and got the gentleman status. This was an incredibly educated man. But then Christopher Marlowe died in 1593, so in all honesty the theory around him being Shakespeare it's wild. Shakespeare's greatest plays wouldn't come out until after 1593. But what if Marlowe faked his own death and then became Shakespeare, writing under a fake name because he's supposed to be dead? Shortly before his death, Marlowe had been arrested and he was facing some pretty serious charges at this time. Atheism, heresy and blasphemy. Every day I'm glad I was born when I was. These charges at this time were considered treason and Marlowe was facing execution for them. But it wouldn't come to that because whilst he was out on bail, he was stabbed and killed. An inquest into his death was held, but the three named witnesses to his death were all argued to be professional liars. They were intelligence agents and con men. The man said to have stabbed Marlowe was a lifelong servant of one of Marlowe's friends, and he was pardoned before he was even brought to trial. Now maybe this is because Marlowe was about to be put to death anyway, but maybe there was a cover-up going on here, because Marlowe wasn't really dead, apparently. Shortly after this point, Shakespeare's work started coming into the sort of public consciousness, and it's argued by anti-strats that Marlowe's later works are almost indistinguishable from early Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was actually accused of trying to reach above his ranks in trying to match university-educated writers like Marlowe. Like Shakespeare is widely considered to have been inspired by Marlowe, and his first folio works such as Henry VI, The Taming of the Shrew and Titus Andronicus are often attributed to Marlowe. They did have a very, very similar writing style, but Shakespeare could have just been inspired. In several of Shakespeare's sonnets and plays, he's said to have made reference to resurrection, with sonnet 74 making reference to the author's body being dead, the coward conquest of a wretch's knife, and death as that fell arrest without all bail, which obviously could be seen as referencing Marlowe's death, or not death. I do think out of all of the suspects here, Marlowe is the one that could make the most sense, which is wild when you're considering the fact that a faked death is involved, but also it is easily explained away. Shakespeare wrote so much, you could find anything that references anything if you look hard enough. He was undeniably inspired by Marlowe, so any similarities in his early work could make sense. Sure, Marlowe had the education that people believed Shakespeare needed, but it's not out of the question that Shakespeare really was just that intelligent, that he really was just a sponge for information and experiences. He could have just been a smart guy, and that could explain everything. There are so many more suspects I could talk about here, but we're going to end with the idea that Shakespeare may have been a woman, possibly the only alternate Shakespeare that the feminist in me could accept. Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, was the most educated woman in England in Shakespeare's time, compared only to Queen Elizabeth. It's said that she was fluent in Italian, French, Latin, she played multiple instruments, she had all of the refinements of an aristocratic woman, she had medical training, falcon hunting, court life, etc. I mean, she even had her own alchemy lab, which is so cool. There were just no women like Mary Sidney in this time. Women weren't generally afforded an education. For 2 decades, Mary was known to have developed and led the most important and influential literary circle in English history, the Wilton Circle. She was the first woman to publish a play in English. She translated and published work from French and Italian. Mary's greatest love in life was literature, writing, but she was a woman. No matter how educated she was never going to be able to publish work on a public stage under her own name. I mean, she would write many plays in her lifetime which would have to be published under her brother's name, Sir Philip Sidney. It is really not out of the question that she would form an entirely new pseudonym to write under, one entirely separate from her family name, until she died in 1621, just 2 months after Shakespeare's first folio went to press. Now, there's little actual evidence to pinpoint Mary as Shakespeare. There are very few comparisons of her writing to make. But she had motivations and she was known to be incredibly talented. She was educated, she was travelled, she had the languages. I mean, think of the things this woman would have done if she was allowed to live as men were. All of this makes me think of the movie St. Trinian's 2, The Legend of Britain's Gold, which is literally about this exact topic. The St. Trinian's movies have a very special place in my heart, and in this film, St. Trinian's 2, which truly is terrible but wonderful, following a life of piracy, Pirate Britain gives up being a pirate to write plays under a new name, William Shakespeare. The students find lost treasure at the end of the film, revealing that Pirate Britain and William Shakespeare was a woman all along. It's iconic. Like, all the St. Trinian's films are iconic, but it's so bad. I love it so much. I personally don't think there's much of a mystery around Shakespeare's authorship, or at least I didn't read anything in my research for this video that convinced me that there's any mystery around Shakespeare's authorship. But please do tell me in the comments down below if you believe that maybe somebody else was responsible for Shakespeare's works. This is a judgment-free zone. I'm a Swiftie who pores over every Taylor Swift lyric like she's leaving a treasure map to hidden gold. So I support all and any harmless conspiracies. Harmless, very much, being the word there. Thank you so much to MyHeritage for partnering with me on this video. Without them, I would not now be able to be insufferable going forward, making sure that everyone knows I am indeed, maybe, probably related to William Shakespeare. Just the most fun fact. Make sure you do check them out in the description box down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I've really enjoyed making this one, I hope you can tell. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.